Good afternoon. On behalf of the Center for Community Progress, I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar. My name is Julia Zimmerman, and I serve as the events coordinator for National Leadership in Education here at Community Progress. With the building blocks to understand and solve tough deterioration. For today's webinar, we are joined by LaTosha, Okoiron, and Brian Larkin. LaTosha Okoiron serves as in-house general counsel and compliance director for the Houston Land Bank, where she handles all legal and compliance matters. Additionally, she has over 15 years of experience as a real estate professional, attorney, adjunct professor, public advocate, business consultant, and equity champion. Okoiron has presented at various national conferences, informational sessions, and classrooms across the country, particularly in Texas, where she's based. Brian Larkin is the director of the National Land Bank Network at Community Progress. Larkin's belief that the built environment has a unique ability to transform lives guided his career focus and work. Today, he leverages his experience as a local land banking and municipal planning leader to help more than 200 land banks connect with education, funding, and networking to positively impact one of America's fastest growing community development movements, the National Land Bank Network. Oh, sorry. Before turning it over to our speakers, I want to mention that we will allow time at the end of the presentation to answer questions. If you have a question during the presentation, please click the stage tab to the right of your screen, select chat, and type your question into the chat box. We will share presentation slides and a video recording of today's presentation in the week following. If you experience any technical difficulties, please send an email to Julia Zimmerman at jzimmerman@communityprogress.org. And with that, I'll turn it over to LaTosha.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for the beautiful introduction, Julia. I am happy today to be speaking to you about contracts and codes what land banks should know about community gardens. Before we begin, I'd like to say good morning to some and good afternoon to some and introduce myself a little before we jump right in. My name is LaTosha Okoiron. As Julia stated, I'm the general counsel for the Houston Land Bank. Prior to coming to the land bank, I primarily dealt in real estate and the ag space, which is a perfect mirroring of these two subjects. When we talk about gardens, we don't typically think of contracts and codes and things of that nature, but it's very important to kind of discuss these things and know these things in dealing with community and urban gardens. So I'm happy to be here, and this should be a fun time. Thank you. Next slide. Okay, so first off, let's talk a little bit about the Houston Land Bank, who we are and what we do. The Houston Land Bank is a local government non-for-profit corporation and recently a 501(c) nonprofit corporation, and the nonprofit piece came in 2002, but our local government corporation was founded in 2018. Prior to that, a lot of you may have known us by LARA, and that is the Land Assemblage Redevelopment Authority. Under LARA, what we did was acquire, assemble, manage, market, and develop property. Now, most of those properties came from foreclosures, delinquent taxes, things of that nature. Currently, we would love to get some of those properties, but the current environment makes it a little harder. So we are acquiring through all types of different means. Now, as the Houston Land Bank, some of our main functions are the acquisition of land. We partner with the City of Houston and various other organizations for home buyers down payment assistance programs, and we are very active in community engagement and planning for the City of Houston and surrounding areas. Next slide. Now, the Houston Land Bank, our mission is to strategically acquire, dispose, and steward vacant, abandoned, and damaged properties. We convey them to productive use and catalyze transformative community and economic development for the city of Houston and surrounding areas. Now, under our powers, we recently, a couple of years ago, uh, came under the authority and purview of a state land banking act. A lot of you may have these acts in your state, and you may not be, maybe something you should legislate or lobby for. Under this increased power, under this legislation, we not only have the power to focus directly on affordable housing, but also economic development, food desert solutions, parks and public spaces, and the conservation of flood and control areas. Now, as you can see, these areas kind of are a wide spreading. So, in regards to community gardens, we typically think of those in the areas of economic development, food desert solutions, and parks, public green space. Next slide, please. Now, using that same consideration for our powers, we also have certain public policy considerations as to why we encourage urban gardens and community gardens. Most of those are to improve food access and overall health of the community, to develop agriculture skills, encourage opportunities for community members, and also environmental considerations such as increased rainwater drainage, increased biodiversity, and increased air quality improvement. Next slide. We should have a poll there, and I don't know if we did that one, but okay. Now, getting into the actual topic of community gardens and urban gardens, one thing that I noticed in relation to the programming for urban and community gardens is these terms seem to be used interchangeably. When someone contacts the land bank or is looking for space, they usually say, I want to create an urban garden, or I want to create a community garden, things like that. And they use these terms interchangeably. But these terms are not interchangeable. If you are operating as a community garden is land where crops and plants are grown and maintained by a group of individuals in the community where the garden is located. So that means it's usually organization of people in the community that are taking turns maintaining, growing in that space. The operation of that space is by multiple members of the community. An urban farm, on the other hand, usually are ran and owned and operated and maintained by an entity or individual that grows some or all of the crops or plants for commercial purposes. In the picture that you see here, this is a urban garden or urban farm in Kansas City, Missouri. And this is a prime example of an urban farm. It also serves a community purpose, but it is ran by an individual entity versus an entire community. Next slide. Next slide. So there should be a poll here. Did we get the poll going? Okay. The poll just went live. There should be a poll. If you can answer that, I can see your answers pop up. Let me see. Okay. Okay. So there, if we could get the actual question on the poll as well. I want everyone to be able to see kind of what the question was and then what the answer is, because I can't really see it. Okay. All right. So it says that roughly 25% of you are experiencing community gardens, 75% urban farms. Okay. Okay, that's good to know. Okay. So the next thing I want to talk about is which land is suitable to offer as community gardens or green spaces as a land bank, and what land should you be looking for if you're looking to approach a land bank for green or gardening space. Now, the first thing you should look at and consider is the land the appropriate size and location for the community it serves. At HLB, in our current program, we target land that is 25 square feet and under. It is an appropriate size for our community, and it serves the neighborhoods appropriately with that size, which kind of leads me to the next question, which says, will it serve as an asset to the community? Is this land that you're asking for or giving for a garden, is it accessible to the community? Is it somewhere that the community can get to easily, that is safe, that is an area where everyone could join? And is it free of other damages or other things that might not make it appropriate and an asset to the community? All those things should be factored as you consider, should I offer this space or is this the space I'm targeting? Now, the absolute no's in regards to these gardens and green spaces are known or suspected environmental issues, no accessibility to parking or water, what kind of goes back to the same thing that we're talking about earlier in regards to, can they actually get to the space? Will the community be able to access water to grow their gardens, or is that going to be an issue? Legally, we want to make sure that we don't need any easements or access agreements from neighbors or others. If we have to have agreements with our neighbors or with other parties or entities that own adjoining land in those spaces, it can create an issue when it's time for termination, or if there are nuisance issues in regards to the garden, and these happen as well. Those easements and access agreements sometimes are terminable and can cause a contractual issue in regards to that. So we want to look for land that is clear and free. It doesn't need access point agreements. It doesn't need easements. There is easy accessibility to water, and we know or don't suspect that there are any environmental issues. Next slide. Now, this is one of the Houston Land Bank's beautiful community gardens. When it comes to allowing for community and urban gardens, you have two options to contract with that entity or that community organization. You can do a land purchase agreement, which simply says, I am deeding the interest from the land bank or from my organization to this community garden free and clear. Or I am deeding our interests from the land bank to this community garden for your uses. It's going to be free, but it's not necessarily clear in the fact that we're going to put some conditions on this land. We're going to put some restrictions in this deed, meaning that even though the property is deeded to you in a purchase agreement, there are certain conditions that you have to comply to in that deed. Some of these restrictions can be you have to make sure that it stays for the community's use, that it's in an affordable area, or the structure of it maintains with a nonprofit, or there are various other restrictions that can be put into this land purchase agreement. Although you're transferring ownership, you can transfer ownership under different conditions. And that is the land purchase agreement. So that's when you're going to be exchanging deed for deed. A to B, now it's in B's ownership. The next way you can convey the land under urban garden is a lease or license agreement. And under this type of agreement, you don't get the ownership bundle that comes with the land purchase agreement. You get the usage of the land under certain conditions, whether it be a lease or a license. If you go that route, there are certain terms and conditions under that we should be aware of. Next slide, please. What's in a name? So if we're going to go the lease route versus the purchase route, we have several types that we could consider. We can consider a lease, we can consider a license, or we can consider a hybrid model, which is a land use agreement. So under the lease, you have exclusive interest in the property under the contract. There's a landlord and tenant relationship, and terms are usually very black and white in this agreement. You have usage of the land, but you don't have ownership of the land. Under a license, the landowner gives permission for the licensee to conduct a certain action on the owner's property. There's an owner and licensee relationship versus a landlord and tenant. A lease, you're going to have a little bit more rights under that lease as the tenant. A licensee, you're going to have a little less rights under that agreement as a licensee, because you're only using it for a particular action or a particular reason. Now, what you can do is use the hybrid land use agreement model. And a lot of people in the land bank space or in the governmental space typically use this type of agreement. It describes and provides the legal framework and terms and conditions for an entity or owner to allow the usage of the owned property by the contracted party. It's usually an entity owned by government entities or private citizens or other entities. So it's a mixture of these agreements. So it's saying, hey, I'm going to give you all the kind of rights a tenant would have, but I'm only going to allow you to use the land for these specific reasons. So it mixes the rights that you have under a lease with the permissions that you're allotted under a license. Next slide. Okay, so there 0% of leases, and this came up so fast I can't see, 10% license, I think that said, and then 90% of a hybrid method. Okay, that's pretty good. So 90% of you think that a hybrid method would work better for either you as a person that is seeking an agreement with the land bank or the land bank itself. And that's pretty correct in regards to what usually happens, because you want to detail as much as you can of the terms of the occupancy. So that really lends itself to that hybrid model. Okay, so next we want to talk about, once we have considered, we have this agreement, we're going forward with it, we want to talk about what actually needs to be in this agreement. Since we are using the hybrid model, and 90% of you guys said that's the model that we should use, I agree in regards to most cases. Let's talk about some contractual points of negotiations that should be included in this agreement. The first is use of the premises. Is the use of the premise too restrictive? And that goes on both sides. Will you have to keep coming back asking, can I do this? Can I do that? Or is it pretty much, this is my land for the term that I am leasing it for, and I am free to do whatever I want to on this land? As a land bank, you want to be restrictive, but you want to allow the tenant to have some flexibility in what they're doing with that space. For example, the example there is if you have a garden, a community garden, an urban garden, you should allow for events that kind of correspond with those types of things. Yoga in the garden, jazz in the garden, things of that nature that kind of flow with the usage and the community purpose of the garden. Now, if you get too outside of the scope, that's where you run into problems. And so you really want to detail what your understanding of this use of premises is. You also, in this piece of the agreement, want to say, hey, if for any reason you're going outside the bounds of the usage of this premise, we would like to terminate this agreement. We have the absolute right to terminate. We can terminate immediately. We can terminate with notice if you go outside the confines of this agreement. Does it allow for commercial purposes? Now, that is going to be kind of some coding and zoning things that you have to be particularly careful for in your respective areas. In our area, we don't too much have that problem. We are very loose in regards to zoning issues, but other areas are not that way. Just check with your local areas to make sure that this area that you have this garden for, or you have this urban farm for, if you're going into the commercial space for it, that zoning allows for that in your actual lease, and notate it with your actual code enforcement, and just make and double check that piece, because what you don't want to do is spend a lot of time, effort, money getting a urban or community garden up and running and find out in your respective localities that you cannot have that there for commercial purposes, or it's not zoned for that, or something of that nature. So always check the location that you want the garden in to make sure that under the code in that area, it's allotted. Liability issues. This is a very, very, very important piece in regards to the points of negotiation. As a landowner, as a land bank, as an entity owner, in regards to the land that you're leasing or licensing out, you want to release a liability. You want the tenant to say, I'm going to assume the liability for the things that happen on this property. You don't want to be held liable for occupants or invitees or anyone that is on that land while you're renting it out. And the best way for a tenant to cover themselves in regards to this is the liability coverage requirements. And that's why it's so important in your leasing agreement that you mandate that your tenants have to have liability coverage. Because we get to the next piece, and that's the indemnity clause. Now, what indemnity clauses are simply is one party moving risk to another party. One party saying, in this instance, I, as the land bank, want you to hold me harmless for anything that happens on your land while we're in this contractual agreement. How I know that you can identify me is I'm going to ask for your certificate of insurance liability coverage. So I know that if anything happens, it's not the land bank trying to pursue or get out of liability from an entity or a group of individuals. And that's why it's also very, very important to understand who you're contracting with. because if you're contracting with a community garden, that is not organized as an entity, you'll have to have some assurances in there in regards to liability that some organization is going to have to be done so someone can have that responsibility for that coverage. Now, a next point of a negotiation would be entry rights. Some things that typically go overlooked that can cause issues in the long run are hours availability. If you have someone that comes to your program and says, hey, I want this land for the community benefit, and you're going to say, okay, we're going to lease you this land for the community, but you notice that it's open, let's say, only 9 a.m. to 10 a.m. every Wednesday, every other Wednesday of the month. Is that really benefiting the community, or is that more of a personal usage thing that's going on there? So I always say, look at the hours of availability, see if it matches up to the purpose to which the request is being made for either a community garden or urban garden. When is it going to be accessible to the public? Is it, however it's going to be, is it going to be staffed during those hours? How is the public going to get in? Is it going to be locked? Is it really, truly going to be there for a community purpose? Now, also, what we have to include in these agreements are notice requirements to entry into the land. So we need to be able to get in that land if it's a total lease environment, or if we have a hybrid situation. Although we have contracted with this entity, with this urban farm or land bank, we need to be able to say, hey, I'll give you, 3 days notice before we're coming on your land, unless there's an emergency and there's something going on in the land that is adverse to health and safety, that we can immediately come in. Which also leads to, we need the right of inspection. If you are stating in your purpose for the garden or farm that these are the reasons that you need this, I need to be able, as a land bank or as an entity that is leasing this land, to inspect routinely or an agreed upon time that this is actually what's going on in the land and on the land. Next slide. Maintenance of the property. This is a really, really, really big issue when it comes to community and urban gardens, for various reasons. You're dealing with a lot of time perishable foods, which comes with certain nuisances and pests and things like that can be a detriment to the neighborhood, that will cause a disturbance in the neighborhood if the property is not maintained properly, if the grass is not cut, if it's not in neat and orderly fashion. That also results in violations and penalties. You need to account for these in your lease. You need to be able to pass on any of those violation costs, any of those penalties, any of those things need to be passed on to the tenant so that you as an entity or land bank is not held responsible for it. You need to have caveats that say you have to keep a safe, clean, attractive condition. And you need to notate a difference between permanent and temporary structures. Why is this important? If a tenant creates a permanent structure and affixes it to your land, you may run into issues at time of termination. They may want to take those structures, which cause damage to the land. All types of things can happen in those situations. So you need to detail, if there's going to be structures on there, what would you classify as temporary structures? What do you classify as permanent structures? And after those classifications are done, What happens at termination? What do we say? What do we keep? What goes? What stays? Everything in regards to those structures needs to be detailed. So at termination time, there is no dispute or litigation. Reporting requirements. This is also very, very important. Make sure that crops are in compliance with regulations of the state, local, and federal level. Uh, you know, different states allow for different types of crops to be grown. Make sure that the crops that are grown in your state adhere to those regulations, and make sure that it's notated in the lease that this is a requirement. And if that requirement is broken, then the lease terminates and penalties may be assessed. Also, make sure that there are reports and photos regarding conditions and usage of the land. That not only protects the land bank, it protects the contracting party, it protects all entities involved. These should at least, at bare minimum, be annual reports and photos, and kind of best practices at least semi-annual. So there's a record of, no, I've maintained this space as a tenant, or no, you didn't maintain it as a land bank, and this is why we're terminating your agreement. It saves a lot of headaches in the long run, and it's very, very useful in regards to termination and compliance issues of keeping the lease enforced. Environmental concerns and requirements. These also need to be addressed in the lease. It's recommended that all the gardening or urban farming needs to be on raised beds, and especially in our area, because of the industrial nature of things, that is the recommendation. Also, testing for hazardous materials, and this is can even be expanded as to what types of fertilizers, non-toxic things can be used in the urban garden. And that is going to be something particular to the contracting parties and based on the area that you actually reside in. Next slide. Now, on that environmental factor, there are various environmental risks to gardens in metropolitan areas that we should speak about, and you should be aware of if you're in land that was previously industrial in nature or commercial, things of that nature, because usually they will yield a higher probability of environmental issues. Now, one thing you need to do is determine the health and suitability of the soil at the site contractually. Who's responsible? Get waivers, etc. Set out those perimeters at the onset of the agreement. Secondly, testing. There are two types of assessments in regards to these environmental issues, and those are environmental assessments. That is phase 1 and phase 2. A phase 1 assessment includes a review by a trained environmental professional of historical site uses, interviews with neighbors, and if possible, site owners, visual site inspections to determine the potential for and type of contamination at that site. If at that time there is some indication of environmental issues after that assessment, then a phase 2 could be potentially needed, and they will advise as to that. Now, there is federal funding available to entities that need to test for these things in regards to any land or potential garden space that you want to contract for. Look for your area brownfields programs, governmental entities we at the land bank have been doing phase ones for that very reason for various entities. Uh, check your local land banks in your areas because they may have access to those types of funds and those type of programs. Also, you can work with your local officials yourself to apply for EPA brownfields grants and provide money for your community to access any cleanup on the properties you're interested in, as well as addressing other properties. Okay, so according to the poll, about 50% of you are conducting phase one assessments and 50% are not. So that is pretty much on par, half and half. I would suggest that becomes a standard in your operations in regards to contracting for these urban gardens, because you remember they're producing food and for the community. So you want to make sure that area is not contaminated, and you want to kind of know what that soil has going on with it. So number 3, which brings us to eliminating soil contaminants. We talked about this before, but building on raised beds, using soil amendments to stabilize contaminants in soil, adding a thick layer of organic matter to your soil. It provides a physical barrier to contamination. Soil amendments have also been used to bind contaminants so that they're no longer mobile or bioavailable. They improve the quality of soil for growing plants and are a good addition to any soil. Also, remove all contaminated soil and replace it with clean soil. Make sure that the replacement soil is clean by asking the supplier for proof that the soil was tested to be contaminant free. There are resources that will help you with this, as we spoke about before, the Brownfields, the EPA, but also your local agriculture cooperative extension offices. We have a great one here that is ran out of Prairie View University. They are excellent in regards to providing soil contamination information and things of that nature. I would also contact them to see what crops are available in your area as far as to grow and what are illegal and things of that nature, to help you craft your lease to be strong in those areas. Next slide. Okay. So, and as Julia mentioned earlier, that these slides will be available for usage, and in these slides you'll have direct links that will take you to kind of the things that we talked about. The first one are the ag cooperative extension services, the EPA technical assistance for brownfields. Kansas State University also has a lot of resources on this area, and the Center for Creative Land Recycling. All will provide technical assistance in helping you craft those soil and environmental requirements in your lease. Next slide. Also, if you have any program questions in regards to our land banking program at the Houston Land Bank, any questions for me, any questions for our team, I work with an amazing set of professionals in their own regard at the Houston Land Bank. They are a wealth of knowledge. Our community engagement manager will be rolling out a new expansion to our community purpose lots, which will include our urban gardens and our community gardens. So if you have any questions concerning those things, or any questions in general just about land banking in regards to this topic, please feel free to contact us. And that's info@houstonlandbank.org. Thank you so much. And we are now open for question and answer.
Tasha, thank you so much for that presentation. We definitely appreciate it. Well, as she mentioned, please put your questions and answers in the chat. I'll be moderating. I wanted to take the privilege and throw the first question. First off, a lot of great information. And when I'm talking to land banks across the country, one of the decision making challenges they have is that piece about liability. And I think you laid a lot about there, how liable am I if something happens, kind of worst case scenario. Can you talk a little bit when you laid out those liability concerns in contract? Is it the same for land lease and land purchases? Those two pieces, do you bear the same liability? Is there a way to transfer that piece? And do you distinguishing? And I guess the larger point is kind of what are the things you need to take into account as an organization if you're going to allow leasing versus purchase agreements as it relates to liability?
Okay, so in general, and this is barring any of those environmental issues we talked about, but in general, once you're doing a land purchase agreement, that liability now lies with the new owner. So as a land bank, once that deed is transferred in regards to regular liability, things happening on the land, people getting hurt on the land, such as those kind of issues go away and they transfer to the new owner. Under a lease, absolutely you have to be careful with that because although you have contracted with a third party for a lease of this land, people will still look on the recorder's office or look or whatever and see that, for example, Houston Land Bank is still the owner of this land. If I go and I trip on an exposed pole that's coming out of the ground at the urban garden, I'm going to look at that location and see Houston Land Bank as the owner. So as a land bank, what I have to do is make sure that I am transferring that liability to the person that is actually available for, responsible for the maintenance of that land. And in that case, it's that tenant. So you want to make sure that they are properly insured. Before you sign off on a lease, before you sign off on any agreement with an entity, require proof of that liability. Look at your minimum coverage level that you will accept if anything happens. And that's usually what can I not afford to pay out as a land bank. And usually land banks are working on a tight budget. So that's usually nothing. So I would say make sure that liability level is high enough that you do not run a risk of having to pay out any claims under your own entity.
And LaTosha, you segue perfectly into the first two questions that come up are specifically about insurance. And so I'm going to put this one up on the screen. The next one that follows up is building off the same question, though. It's minimum insurance. Do you guys have a standard that you utilize at the Houston Land Bank for the minimum insurance you require for gardens? And specifically if you could talk about in your area, are there insurance providers? Do you have you noticed a challenge, or is it pretty accessible for your transferees to acquire the insurance they need? Do you have minimum
So
requirements, and is it easy for them to get it?
yes, we do have minimum requirements, but we also are reviewing our requirements at the moment. So we are actually looking probably to increase our insurance requirements. I don't want to say what our minimum is because it's not flexible. What I would say though is a good range is at least, I would say bare minimum 250,000, something like that, and then upwards in that range. Now, are there insurance providers that are willing to cover for groups that are not fully incorporated as nonprofits? Uh, yes and no. They are going to require a higher level of proof in regards to what they're asking for if you don't have a recognized entity by the state. Now, that doesn't mean that you cannot get insurance under an individual policy or a DBA, which is doing business as, but it's not really a legal form of business, but this is what you're calling yourself, and people know you're doing business like that under the state. So it is not an absolute no, but it's always stronger to have a organized entity contracting for the garden or the urban or community garden.
Thank you for that, LaTosha. And recognizing that this next one kind of builds off, I think the first piece is a statement and it gets to the second half of what you were getting at. While you're reading through that, I'll provide a little context. Most of the land banks who are here are dealing in communities that are underprivileged, under-resourced communities, disadvantaged places, and trying to find ways to transfer property into the ownership hands of diverse partners that typically weren't the recipients of land here. And at sometimes a lot that threshold or that barrier that prevents the great partner from starting that garden piece is the insurance. They may be just a person of one or the other places. So Amanda's question is really getting at not as much within the context of what we have in our contracts, but maybe what you've seen in practice in Houston. And as far as innovative solutions or products that are out there, and are there ways that individuals, block club groups, or really small groups have found ways around this insurance barrier that you have witnessed?
So I would say I want to look at this second piece, that to allow for diverse users or entity types or use types. As I mentioned before, I wouldn't let that be a barrier. One thing that I've seen, even in these community gardens, they can create social, and that's a big thing in Houston. They can create social clubs. They can create just a community organization on paper that is organized. Like I said, as an official filing with the state, that's like $25. You have to look at your actual local business law, and that's why it's a little hard to kind of give across the board advice in that regard, because I can only speak for Texas. But look to your state Secretary of State and see what is the lowest form of entity that they have. A lot of times it will be something very, very $25 non-incorporated nonprofit or something like that. Encourage your community gardens to do that, to your urban farms to at least do that piece, because on the insurance end, it's going to make it much, much easier. In regards to innovative solutions to insurance, I'm going to say, and this is going to be my legal training coming in at this, please just get a bare minimum amount of insurance. I understand the barriers to that, but it is better to have something bare minimum than nothing at all. And like I said, your respective states will have an organizational piece that allows to get organized in some way for some nominal fee. And you take that organization that your state allows and shop it for the insurers, and you can come up with some sort of insurance policy. Now, on the part of the land bank, you need to look programmatically and say, hey, maybe we have exceptions for certain usage. Maybe, we allow certain people to be self-insured. That is something that each individual land bank has to decide program-wise and assess if they're willing to take that liability on. So that's generally, it depends on the land bank and your positioning, if you're willing to take that on.
So again, please guys, keep your questions coming in the chat. I'll try to get to as many as possible as we're going through here. But I just wanted to throw another one of my own. I know that I've heard from the field here. Much of what we talk about today is how do you build out your program? How do you make sure you have the pieces in place when you have the partners ready? But a slight step before that, but a part of this is, what do you do when you have competing offers? So when you have multiple individuals who are interested, do you have policies in place that address that on the front end? How are you able to deal with that when competing offers for one specific parcel to potentially do community garden?
So for that question, that's a great question. You're going to look at the highest potential use for the community. Which entity is going to serve the community the best? How strong are they as an entity? Can they sustain the term of the lease that you're looking at? Just looking at how strong their actual program is, you kind of have to create a scoring matrix, especially in the area to which that property is in, right? So if you know that, hey, this property is in an area where there are no food options, well, you're probably going to score the absolute community garden higher than you will with the mixed use space with the urban farm and the yoga and the cycling and all of that. So you're going to take into account the environment, the area, the standing of the organization. How successful have they been in the past? Are they a strong community supporter? Is it a startup? Is it something that has potential to go the distance for the community? All of those factors come into consideration in deciding who's going to get this parcel of land.
The next one is a softball question on the front end. Hold on, having a little bit of technical challenges. There we go. One of the most important thing with these conversations are, okay, where do the documents come from? You've laid out a lot of key programs and key aspects that you have in your contracts. Is there a place that you would recommend individuals go, or do you guys at Houston have some sample templates of these contracts that you've talked about today?
Well, so each particular contract is made with that individual entity, but we do kind of use a format, but we kind of change the details according to the deal. I will be willing to work with the Center for Community Progress to put some sample out there if they believe that it's helpful for everyone, just a template. So that's something we can look into doing for sure.
Yeah, that sounds like a great idea. I would definitely like to work with you guys on that and see if that would be useful in a way. In addition to figuring out templates for organizations, I think it's just helpful in general to understand what's going on and what's out there. Sometimes I know for National Land Bank Network members, we're working on a resource library where we're keeping track of the existing ones. And so even if we aren't to the template yet, like here's a program or here's a form or here's a document utilized by places. So yeah, definitely we'll work together and find a way to make that happen.
Yeah, that's a great idea. I like that. Just something that will get
All
you
right. And
started.
so
Uh-oh.
So looking at time, we have time for one last question. I'm going to put it up on the screen here and then let LaTosha close out. It's related to activities that are outside of the traditional and LaTosha, while you're reading inventory that are in land banks are structure-free lots. And so figuring out creative ways to utilize this temporary space are going to be very, very important. So LaTosha, any thoughts on Amanda's question here?
So that's a very good question, Amanda. We are actually looking at that right now. And Lindsay, who is on our team, HLB, and that's the program that I was saying, the community purpose lots. We are looking to create those kind of relationships with non-traditional creative space. And we've already been pitched some wonderful ideas for those places, and those are our community access lots. Again, for us, those are the ones that are under 2,500 square feet in different flood level planes and for the community usages. So yes, we are looking at those non-traditional open spaces, not green spaces and community gardens, but things outside of there. Small business things that would help the community. Transportation things, incubator spaces, all those types of things we are looking at for our community usage space. So we're looking outside that typical community urban garden park, things that will actually go to our economic development of that area.
Well, LaTosha, again, thank you so much. Any last words or thoughts for land banks that are interested in putting together the contracts that are necessary to do this kind of work? And I'll leave the floor to you for closing thoughts.
Yeah, so I would say one big piece of it is before you enter into those contracts, kind of do some due diligence on the front end. See if this agency, nonprofit, for-profit is really who they say they are, and they're doing what they say they're doing. Once you have that comfortability, then just kind of go over the things that we talked about. Find a template that works for you, sit down with them, and come up with a contract that works for both parties and that is workable. I always say contracts really are a meeting of the minds. Make sure that those expectations are understood on both sides of the agreement. It'll save you a ton of compliance issues, and it'll save you a lot of time, and hopefully you will never have to go into court with any of those issues. And also just keep doing great things in the community. I know I see a lot of awesome things out there. When we were in Cleveland, I seen some amazing community gardens out there. So keep doing what you're doing in the community. It really benefits the community, but just make sure that you're protecting yourself as an entity.
Awesome. Thank you so much, LaTosha. That was an amazing closing. Thank you for a great webinar. Thank you, Brian, for a great job moderating. And thank all of you for showing up and participating in the webinar today. We'll be sending out a recording of this webinar and the presentations and any additional resources within the next week. So be on the lookout for that. And we hope to see you in November for our next Community Progress webinar.
Thank you, guys.